Mysterious death getting nationwide attention after attending a July 4th boat trip with friends and never returning home. Now, a Mississippi grand jury will determine if criminal charges will be brought after the family's private autopsy couldn't rule out foul play in Nolan Wells' death.
There were 300 to 400 people out on Horns Island. You mean to tell me nobody saw anything?
Any parent that would be in this situation, you would do anything to find out what happened to your child.
You know, Nancy, Attorney Ben Crump there has a point. You mean no one saw anything? Where do you see this investigation, where things stand?
I've got a lot of problems with the investigation so far, but remember, we are seeing through a mirror darkly. We don't know all the evidence. There's been one state's autopsy, and that has not been released. The family sent the body of Nolan Wells for a second independent autopsy, and that...
If you watch this entire breakdown and still walk away without committing to see this through, ask yourself what that says about how much you really care about justice. Because before a grand jury ever sees the official evidence, the public has already been handed 3 different versions of what happened to Nolan Wells on Horn Island. A viral video that turned out to show someone else, a clothing detail that sparked a national dispute, an independent autopsy that raised more questions than it answered, and a mother who buried her son without ever getting a straight answer about what happened to him. Tonight, we are not choosing a side between accident and foul play. We are not asking which theory is loudest. Every claim gets sorted into one of 4 categories: confirmed, claimed, disputed, or still unknown. The moment you stop separating those, you stop investigating and start guessing. Nolan Wells was 18 years old, a senior football player at Ocean Springs High School, remembered by the people who knew him for an easy smile and a quiet steadiness, the kind of young man who made you feel like you mattered just by being in his orbit. His mother, Christine Wansley, has described him as the center of her world, the light of her life, the son she never imagined she'd have to bury. On July 4th, Nolan joined a group of friends on a boat headed for Horn Island, a barrier island off the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Uninhabited, federally protected land accessible only by boat. Every summer it draws crowds of holiday revelers. That weekend, it was packed. Nolan was last seen alive sometime around 3 in the afternoon on the island's northwestern tip. At some point after that, his friends made the trip back to the mainland. Nolan did not go with them. His phone stayed behind too, left with the group as they returned home. That night, when Nolan still hadn't turned up, his mother reported him missing. A multi-agency search followed. Coast Guard, Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, National Park Service, combing the waters around an island most people outside the Gulf Coast had never heard of. For 2 days, there was no sign of him. Then, on July 6th, the park ranger found his body along the shoreline just off Horn Island. Dental records later confirmed his identity. An independent autopsy commissioned separately from the state's official examination ruled Nolan's cause and manner of death undetermined, pending further investigation. As of this recording, more than 3 weeks after his body was found, the state's own complete autopsy findings still haven't been made public. What started as a local search off a small barrier island has since become a story followed nationwide, drawing news crews and millions of strangers into one family's worst nightmare. These are the facts that hold steady no matter which version of this story you hear next. Nolan went to the island. His friends left without him. His phone made it back to the mainland. He did not. 2 days later, he was found. Everything beyond that point starts to shift, depending on who's telling it. And the first shift came almost immediately, before a single piece of medical evidence had even been examined. Someone stepped forward with an explanation for what happened to Nolan, long before anyone could have actually known. If you've made it this far, you've already invested something in this story. You've heard Nolan's name. You've felt the weight of what his family has been through, and that means you have a choice to make. The world looked away from cases like this for decades. Don't look away now. Every person who subscribes is a witness, and witnesses are what the dead deserve. That explanation came from the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, and it came fast. According to Nolan's mother, Christine, she reached out to the sheriff herself, just checking for any update. He called her back, and in that call, less than an hour after her son's body had been pulled from the water, he told her plainly, This looked like an accidental drowning, no foul play. Publicly, Sheriff John Ledbetter said something similar. The day after Nolan's body was found, he told reporters there was no initial indication of a crime. His friends, he said, were cooperating. His office later said in plain terms that no foul play had been identified. But here's what matters. Even as that language went out into the world, Ledbetter's own department kept saying the investigation itself was far from finished. His office pushed the public for more, asking anyone near the northwestern tip of Horn Island that day to come forward with photos, videos, anything, especially footage of an argument, a disturbance, or Nolan himself. So which is it? A closed case or an open one? Because those two signals, an early cause of death and a still active investigation, don't usually sit comfortably side by side. From one angle, this looks like a completely ordinary way to begin a death investigation. Nolan disappeared near open water, known locally for dangerous currents. His body was recovered close to where he was last seen. Drowning is statistically the most common explanation for a young man who goes missing near water and turns up dead 2 days later. A working theory based on location and condition isn't reckless. It's how investigations often start. From another angle, there's a real problem with timing. Toxicology hadn't come back. The state's own autopsy hadn't been completed. Witnesses hadn't all been interviewed. And yet, within an hour of recovering a body, the public was handed a conclusion. Drowning, no foul play, before any of that evidence existed. To Nolan's family, that timing wasn't neutral. It was the moment, they say, that shaped everything that followed. How reporters framed the case, how strangers online treated their questions, how quickly grieving parents became parents who wouldn't accept an accident. So, you have to ask yourself, was this a reasonable starting point built on where Nolan was found and how? Or was it a conclusion announced before investigators had the information to actually reach one? Let's talk about what happened next. Right around this same time, something else started circulating. A piece of video from that same afternoon on Horn Island that seemed to capture exactly the kind of conflict the sheriff's office said didn't exist. And for quite a while, almost everyone who saw it truly believed it showed Nolan. Because for a while, that one belief was the whole story. It started with Ben Crump, the attorney representing Nolan's family. At a press conference, Crump pointed to a video shot from a boat of a group of people on Horn Island and said Nolan could be heard in it, angry, demanding that his phone be handed back to him. When a reporter asked how anyone could be sure it was Nolan's voice, Crump said multiple people had identified it as his, and once an attorney representing the grieving family says that out loud in front of national cameras at a press conference watched by millions, it stops being a rumor. It becomes part of the record. News outlets picked it up. Commenters picked it apart frame by frame, syllable by syllable. For a stretch of days, this clip was treated as one of the closest things to hard evidence the public had. Maybe Nolan was in a struggle over his phone in his final hours. Maybe that struggle meant something. Then on July 13th, Traston Shepard sat down for an interview with ABC News, and he said something that upended all of it. The voice everyone had spent days analyzing wasn't Nolan's, it was his. Shepard said there was no conversation about a phone anywhere in that video. What people were actually hearing, he said, was him shouting at friends who were physically holding him back, telling them to let him go so he could get back into a separate altercation entirely. An argument, yes, just not the one, and not the person the public had been told. Sit with that fact for a second, because here's the part that actually matters. The video itself never changed. Not one frame, not 1 second of audio was altered between Crump's press conference and Shepard's interview. What changed was the story wrapped around it. One version turned this footage into possible evidence of conflict involving Nolan in his final hours. The other version turned the exact same clip into an unrelated fight between two people who had nothing to do with what happened to him afterward. Same video. Two completely different cases being built on top of it. To be clear, neither version proves what ultimately happened to Nolan. Shepard, correcting the record, doesn't tell us how Nolan died any more than Crump's original claim did. What it tells us is something else, something arguably more unsettling. How fast an unverified clip filmed from a moving boat with unclear audio can travel from possible confrontation to confirmed detail in the public's mind before anyone had actually confirmed anything at all. The only way stories like this continue to be told is if people like you choose to care, choose to stay, choose to be part of the community that won't let go. So ask yourself this honestly. If the public got this wrong, this publicly, this confidently, and it still took over a week for a correction to surface, what else in this case has been accepted as fact simply because it was said out loud first? And here's the harder question, the one that should genuinely bother you. Shepard's correction did get coverage. ABC News ran it, other outlets followed. But corrections almost never travel as far as the original claim. The press conference clip had already been watched, shared, and argued over by millions of people before Shepard ever sat down for that interview. So once a correction like this lands after the original has already gone viral, which version do you think the public actually remembers? Because that gap between what was said first and what was quietly corrected later is exactly where this case starts to get genuinely complicated. That gap is where Nolan's friends finally started talking. Not all at once, not in a single sit-down interview, in a slow drip stretched across nearly 3 weeks, each new appearance adding another layer to a story that kept refusing to sit still. The most recent came on July 25th, when Traston Shepard sat down with conservative commentator Brandon Tatum. He described Nolan as his best friend, the kind of person he knew he could call at any hour. He walked through the same altercation he'd mentioned before, the one that pulled him off the island with his uncle's boat before the day ended. And then he said something new. He wondered out loud whether things could have gone differently if he'd stayed, whether he might have talked Nolan into leaving with him instead of staying behind with a young woman he just met. "I beat myself up every night I lay down," Shepard said, adding the thought crosses his mind constantly, no matter what he's doing. That's a heavy thing to carry, and it sounded genuine, but here's where we have to slow down. Guilt is not the same thing as an answer. A person can lie awake replaying a decision and still not actually know what happened after they walked away. Shepard's remorse tells us how he feels about leaving. It doesn't tell us what happened to Nolan once he was gone. And there's another wrinkle worth sitting with. Nolan's mother, Christine Wansley, has publicly pushed back on how close that friendship really was. She said she and Nolan's father never met Shepard, that he'd never once been to their home, and that calling him Nolan's best friend was, in her words, a bit of a stretch. She hasn't dismissed everything Shepard has shared, but it's a reminder that even the language used to describe Nolan's relationships is being contested in real time. If this case stayed with you, if that gap between what was said first and what was corrected later is still sitting in the back of your mind, then you already know what you need to do next. Subscribe, not for us, for him, for every victim who never got to tell their own story. Which brings us to the young woman. According to Shepard and several of the other friends who were there, Nolan chose to stay on Horn Island because he'd met a young woman earlier that day, and he planned to catch a ride back to the mainland with someone else later on. She has not given a full public interview. What we do have is Nolan's mother saying she spoke with the young woman privately and came away understanding their interaction as brief. Nothing more than two strangers crossing paths for an afternoon. So, here's the honest question. Was this young woman actually the reason Nolan stayed behind on that island? Or has she simply become the easiest explanation to attach to a decision that otherwise makes no sense to those who knew him best? A convenient answer that lets everyone stop asking harder ones. To be absolutely clear, nothing here suggests she bears any responsibility for what happened to Nolan afterward. She is not a suspect. She is at most one more unanswered thread in an afternoon full of them. Then there's the phone. Warren Hudson, another friend who traveled to the island with Nolan, has addressed this directly in his own interviews with Tatum. He said leaving phones on boats wasn't unusual that day. People were spending hours waist-deep in water, and nobody wanted to risk dropping a phone into the Gulf. He flatly denied that he or anyone in the group ever touched Nolan's phone, denied deleting anything from it, and said nobody even had access to Nolan's password. Nolan's parents have raised concerns of their own, saying that when they eventually got the phone back, they found it stripped of messages and videos on Snapchat, a detail Christine Wansley has called suspicious. Hudson maintains there's nothing to hide. He says the phone simply sat on the boat until a family friend, someone he described as close with the Wells family, asked for it directly, and it was handed over without incident. To Hudson, none of this is a mystery. To Nolan's family, the mystery was never really about the phone's movements. It's about why Nolan, by every account, chose to remain on an isolated island without it. based only on what's been said publicly and not on any complete forensic record, the path looks something like this. The phone starts in Nolan's possession. It moves to the boat. The boat carries it back to the mainland along with the other friends and their devices. It's later handed to a family connection. And now it's reportedly part of a joint forensic inspection that traces where the phone went step by step, according to the people who were holding it. It does not explain why the one person who actually needed it, the one person who ended up alone on an island in the middle of the Gulf, didn't take it with him. And until somebody can genuinely answer that, the phone's journey back to the mainland tells us far less than it might first appear to. While all of that played out, another detail was quietly turning into its own controversy. Not about the phone, not about the video, about something as simple and as strange as what Nolan was wearing when he was found. At the NAACP convention in Chicago on July 22nd, the same appearance where Ben Crump revealed the independent autopsy results, he told the crowd that Nolan had been recovered face down and fully clothed. To a lot of people watching, that single detail landed harder than almost anything else in the announcement. It's an easy thing to fixate on. If Nolan had gone from swim trunks into a full outfit sometime after his friends left the island, that would suggest activity. Maybe even other people involved in whatever happened during his final hours. Then, the United Cajun Navy, the volunteer search organization involved in recovering him, pushed back publicly and pushed back hard. In a statement shared online, they said Nolan was wearing only the same blue swim trunks seen in photos from earlier that day. Nothing more. They denied ever telling Crump or Nolan's family that he'd been found fully clothed and accused Crump directly of misrepresenting what they'd said. The exchange quickly spilled onto social media, with the organization publicly tagging Crump and insisting the record be corrected. So where did fully clothed actually come from? By the organization's own account, it traced back to an earlier television interview when Nancy Grace asked their founder, Todd Terrell, on air whether Nolan had been found face down, still fully clothed. Terrell said, "Yes, that was correct. It was a small, almost throwaway exchange at the time, but he later admitted in a separate interview that he probably should have corrected her in the moment, explaining that he'd only meant Nolan wasn't naked, that technically his body was clothed in the same swim trunks and nothing else." Imprecise words said in passing on cable news, then repeated by an attorney at a nationally covered press conference. And suddenly, a volunteer search group was publicly accusing a prominent civil rights lawyer of lying to a grieving family. So which is this really? A meaningful contradiction buried inside the official account of how Nolan was found? Or one loosely worded answer on a television interview, echoed at a podium weeks later, and blown into a headline that millions of people now have a strong opinion about without ever hearing the original exchange it came from? Here's what's worth remembering. Either way, whether Nolan was in swim trunks alone or fully dressed doesn't by itself tell us how he died. It doesn't confirm a drowning. It doesn't confirm an assault. It doesn't confirm anything else happened to him out there on that island. Clothing alone was never going to answer that particular question, no matter how loudly people argued about it online. But while the public argued over a boat video and now a pair of swim trunks, the independent autopsy was quietly raising a far bigger problem, one that no wardrobe detail, however contested, could ever touch or resolve. It couldn't say how Nolan died at all. That gap between question and answer is exactly where the independent autopsy lives, and it's arguably the single most important piece of evidence in this entire case. The examination was performed on July 10th by Dr. Roger Mitchell, a board-certified forensic pathologist, president of the National Medical Association, former chief medical examiner for the District of Columbia. This wasn't some hired gun with no credentials brought in to tell a grieving family what they wanted to hear. It was a serious, credentialed second look at Nolan's body, conducted 6 days after he disappeared and 4 days after his body was recovered from the water near Horn Island. Here's what Mitchell's report actually found. No skull fracture was identified, no deep tissue injury severe enough to point clearly toward a specific cause of death. What the report did identify was an area of red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head, something noticeable enough to document carefully, but not something Mitchell could explain with any real confidence. An outside forensic pathologist brought in afterward by a national news outlet to review the findings said that kind of discoloration could represent something as unremarkable as ordinary decompositional changes in the tissue. The natural result of a body spending time in warm water. Or that same expert said in the very same breath it could represent a blunt force injury to the back of the head and neck. Entirely different explanations, both medically plausible, and Mitchell's own report could not tell us which one was true. In the end, both the cause and the manner of Nolan's death were listed as undetermined, pending further investigation. Part of why comes down to timing and physical condition. The report itself noted marked decompositional changes in Nolan's body by the time this second later autopsy took place, and part of it comes down to what Mitchell didn't have in front of him. He wrote that he never received Nolan's internal neck structures, including the trachea, material that had already been retained during the original state examination. Mitchell said he didn't know why the first pathologist chose to keep those structures. Now, before this turns into another accusation of a cover-up, it's worth being precise and careful here, because this is exactly the kind of detail that gets exaggerated online. Doctors who spoke to reporters about this said it is not unusual for a pathologist to hold on to an organ or piece of tissue for closer examination, particularly when there's any concern about a fracture that needs more time under a microscope. If a second independent autopsy is requested afterward, there's often a real delay before that retained tissue becomes available for the new examiner to see. Retaining evidence for further testing is standard forensic practice. It is not by itself proof that anyone did anything wrong. So let's be exact and completely fair about what this independent autopsy actually accomplished and what it plainly didn't. It did not confirm outright that Nolan was murdered. It did not confirm that Nolan drowned by accident. It did not identify a fractured skull or any single injury investigators could point to and call fatal. And it could not tell us clearly whether that discoloration on the back of his head came from something that happened to Nolan while he was still alive, or simply from what happens to any human body left in warm coastal water for 2 full days. What this report actually delivered wasn't an answer. It was a documented, credentialed list of exactly how much still isn't known. 3 weeks after Nolan's body was pulled from the water. And the report that might actually resolve some of this, the state's own complete autopsy conducted by the original medical examiner with access to organs and structures Mitchell never received, is still the one document the public has not been allowed to see. Until it is, everything you've just heard remains exactly what it's always been. A serious, credentialed list of open questions, not a conclusion. If you want to see this through to the end, if you want to be part of the community that made sure this case didn't go cold, if you believe Nolan Wells deserves more than just another news cycle, there's one thing you can do. Subscribe. Not because this channel wants your subscription, but because these stories don't get told without people like you caring. Because the algorithm rewards attention, and attention leads to answers. Every subscription is a promise that we will keep digging, that we will not let these cases go cold again. That word grand jury is exactly where a lot of viewers' minds jump straight to the worst possible conclusion. Murder charges, an indictment, a dramatic courtroom trial waiting just around the corner. Slow down for a second, because that's not actually what this means, at least not yet. And understanding why matters more than you'd think. On July 23rd, Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McRath addressed this directly in a recorded statement. The pressure for answers does not change what the work requires, she said. Then she explained something that a lot of the public simply didn't know. In Jackson County, every single death investigation except deaths from natural causes and non-criminal car accidents gets presented to a grand jury as a matter of routine. Not because prosecutors suspect a crime, because that's simply the process in every case for her entire career. Her office went further. Convening a grand jury, they said, does not by itself mean any criminality occurred. It's the standard procedure for unnatural or suspicious deaths across the county, full stop. And here's the detail that should reframe everything you just heard. Ben Crump, the family's own attorney, confirmed that's exactly what the DA told them directly in a private meeting. So Nolan's case being sent to a grand jury doesn't confirm investigators found evidence of a crime. It confirms his death wasn't natural or a routine accident report. And that's it. What actually happens next depends entirely on what that jury is shown behind closed doors. Based on how this process typically works, jurors could review the evidence and find enough there to support criminal charges against someone. They could review that same body of evidence and find it insufficient to move forward at all. Or they could conclude that based on everything currently gathered, Nolan's death simply can't be explained beyond what's already known right now. These are reasonable possibilities given the process, not confirmation of what prosecutors will actually present once that room is sealed. Which raises a genuinely difficult question, one this case keeps circling back to. McGrath has said publicly more than once that her office's silence isn't about hiding anything from Nolan's family or the wider community. Mississippi's professional conduct rules restrict prosecutors from discussing active evidence in cases like this, and she said releasing details too early could taint witnesses or compromise the fairness of the proceeding itself. So should authorities release more information right now publicly to maintain trust in an investigation this heavily scrutinized? Or does holding back actually protect the one thing that matters most here? A fair, uncompromised path to whatever the truth turns out to be, no matter how long that takes. That tension between transparency and protection isn't just playing out in a courthouse, it's playing out online every single day, and it's already left real damage behind. Traston Shepard has said repeatedly that speaking out cost him death threats, racist hate messages. He appeared on Good Morning America back on July 13th with his voice deliberately altered because he genuinely feared for his safety. Nolan's mother, Christine Wansley, has faced her own version of this. Hate mail arrived at her family's home in the days before she buried her son. She's since posted publicly asking total strangers to please stop weaponizing her grief, saying plainly and firmly that this isn't a joke to her family, no matter how it reads to people online. Meanwhile, the public has split into two increasingly hostile camps, each one completely convinced the other is either naive or acting in bad faith. Treats Nolan's death as an obvious, deliberate crime, demanding arrests before a single charge has even been filed. The other treats it as an obvious, simple accident, dismissing every unanswered question as manufactured outrage. Both camps are speaking with total certainty, and neither the official cause nor the manner of Nolan's death has actually been determined. This case stopped being only about Nolan somewhere along the way. It's become a proxy fight over race, friendship, policing, grief, media responsibility, and who the public is even allowed to trust anymore. And that creates a real tangible risk. One worth naming directly. Witnesses may start shaping their memories around whatever theory is trending instead of what they actually saw that day. Honest corrections get treated as fresh lies. Genuine inconsistencies get waved off as internet noise not worth investigating. And somewhere underneath all of it, an 18-year-old who loved his friends and his family risks disappearing entirely beneath the argument being fought in his name. So ask yourself this honestly before we close this chapter of his story. Is all of this relentless public pressure actually protecting the integrity of Nolan's investigation? Or is the noise itself, the threats, the certainty, the competing camps, making it harder for anyone, including the people meant to find the truth, to separate real evidence from the narrative everyone's already decided to believe? That question is really where this entire story has been heading since the very first minute. So let's close by sorting it one last time into the four categories we opened with. What's confirmed? Nolan went to Horn Island. His friends left without him. His phone made it back. And he didn't, and his body was found 2 days later. What's claimed? That he stayed behind for a young woman, and that leaving phones on boats was simply routine. What's disputed? The viral video, the wording around his clothing, how close that friendship really was. What remains unknown? How Nolan entered the water, when exactly he died, and what actually caused it. Right now, 3 versions of Nolan's story are competing for your belief. There's the version told by his friends, young men trying to explain their choices while living under threats. There's the version told by his family, parents refusing to accept an early explanation that arrived before the evidence did. And then there's the version sitting inside evidence the public still hasn't seen. The complete state autopsy, full witness statements, the phone's forensic results, the entire investigative record. Until that version surfaces, remember this: Silence isn't proof, grief isn't proof, suspicion isn't proof, and an explanation isn't proof either, simply because it sounds believable. You stayed until the end. You heard Nolan's name. You heard his mother's story. You heard the frustration. You felt the injustice. Now do the only thing that makes sense. Subscribe, because he deserves to be remembered, and we can't do that without you. The only way stories like this continue to be told is if people like you choose to care, choose to stay, choose to be part of the community that won't let go. So here's what I'm asking, and I'm not asking lightly. If this case stayed with you, if that gap between what was said first and what was corrected later is still eating at you, if you believe Nolan Wells deserves justice, subscribe, share this video, drop a comment. Tell us which thread you think matters most. The video, the phone, the clothing, or the autopsy nobody's been allowed to read. We read every single one. We want to know where you're watching from, and until next time, the truth is patient, and so are we. We'll see you in the next